Ian Bassin, welcome back to the podcast.
It's good to be back here, Yascha.
So Ian, you and I started talking right around the election in 2016. We were both trying to make sense of what is happening in the world and what the first presidency, as we now know it was, of Donald Trump would mean for the United States and the world. You were starting an organization called Protect Democracy, which has grown enormously since and plays a really important role in the kind of ecosystem of people who are trying to defend democratic norms and rules. What about where we're at today do you think would have surprised us back in 2016, 2017? And what of where we're at today do you think, we might have expected, nearly a decade ago?
I mean, you've kind of teed up an opportunity for maybe both of us to do something that normally would be considered a bit immodest or, sort of impolite to sort of say, we were right. And I don't say that to be self-aggrandizing towards both of us. I say it because I actually think it's important to mark and for people to note. Michelle Goldberg has a piece in the New York Times this week, says the resistance libs were right. And what I mean by that is, like, you and I both, and you in particular, really saw coming what was building around the world, and you've talked about on this podcast a lot, a global move away from democracy towards more liberal, more authoritarian forms of government. And we started talking right after the 2016 election because it was apparent that Trump's election marked the real landing of that global dynamic here on American shores. And what we built together with your advice, so you and I spoke, it was like November 2016, December 2016, and I spoke to you, I spoke to Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, I spoke to Kim Shapley, I spoke to Tim Snyder, Ann Applebaum, and all of you had been kind of banging the drum for a while that we needed to be on guard, that the idea of democracy was losing altitude, and that this more competitive hybrid form of authoritarianism was rising around the world, and we should be prepared for it in the United States. And one of the things I asked you and some of the other, your peers in the field, was, what does it look like when this happens? Is there a pattern you can see play out? And you've written about this, and you all basically said a version of, yep, there's a pattern. You're going to see, the politicization of independent institutions like the civil service, the law enforcement, the military, the spreading of disinformation, the aggrandizing of executive power, the quashing of dissent, the corrupting of elections. There was a playbook you laid out. And pretty much everything you said has come to pass. And so big picture answer to your question is, I'm not really surprised by anything that we are seeing. They are the things that you and others in your field and we at Protect Democracy said were going to happen, even down to the detail of, after Trump lost in 2020, recognizing that in Hungary, it was Orban 2.0 that was more dangerous than Orban 1.0. That in the years that Orban was out of power in Hungary, he basically built what he called sort of a central political force field to protect him and his allies when they returned to power, and then executed a much more devastating assault on the Hungarian system. And we said that there was a possibility that would happen here. What we got wrong initially was we thought it would be someone other than Trump that would kind of pick up the mantle and do Trumpism 2.0. And I think it took a while to realize, no, it's actually going to be Trump himself. But we were saying during those intervening years that was the real danger. So big picture, I'm not surprised by what we're seeing. I think we're seeing pretty much exactly what we expected.
So that's really interesting. I think I kind of look back at how we saw the world in 2016, 2017, in some ways a little bit more critically, but it'll be interesting to tease that out in the conversation. I mean, one way of thinking about this is to split the question into different component parts. And one component part is, did we correctly predict the nature of the attack on democratic norms and institutions that Donald Trump and his administration would push forward? And then perhaps the other question is, did we sufficiently understand both what had produced that moment and what the right ways were to resist and oppose those power grabs? And I think on the first question, which is a very important question, I would, like you, immodestly give us pretty high marks. I think on the second question, I would give myself at least much lower marks, and that's something that I've been trying to grapple with. But let's stay with a positive, the negative news.
Let's break your. I think you have three questions in there, right? And one of them, which I don't want to gloss over, is really interesting. One is like, how accurately did we predict the things that he would do, the ways he would try to dismantle American democracy? And on that one, I think we were quite accurate. The things you've written, we put out a document in 2024. Called the Authoritarian Playbook 2025, laying out what Trump would do if he came back into power. If you look at that document, it's remarkably accurate, weaponizing law enforcement to go after his opponents, deploying the military to the streets of American cities, remarkably accurate. Now, thankfully, it wasn't that hard because he kind of told us, and his allies told us what to do. But that's question one. Question two you had in there was, what were the causes of this? Why? What is driving this? That's I would like to spend some time on that one. And then question three is, what responses would work? And I think where you are suggesting maybe giving us collectively lower marks on that last one, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, first off, when Trump was reelected, I had a moment of, I think, existential crisis on a number of fronts. One was we had been working as an organization for 8 years to try to prevent the decline of American democracy into something more authoritarian, and now it was happening. So there's a little bit of like, well, we better not try doing the same thing over and over again. We'd fall into the sort of the Einsteinian trap of expecting different results. And one of the things that we did a lot of in the first Trump term was using litigation in the courts as a way of trying to check autocratic consolidation. And I think, after Trump's reelection, I was much more hesitant to put so much weight on that strategy. Now, I think that strategy has actually done better than I thought it would over the last year. I was worried that in 2025, there would be a lot of effort put on court battles. A lot of our allies would do a lot of that, win a bunch of early victories in the lower courts, and then have those all get erased eventually when they got up to the Supreme Court. And we would find ourselves, come the end of the Supreme Court term in June, with essentially the croupier kind of wiping all of our chips off the table because we put all our chips on the court basket and being like, well, where's our pile of chips? And so I thought very much at the beginning of 2025 it was important not to put all of our chips on courts, and to put that we were facing a political problem more than a legal problem, and to put more chips on the sort of political coalition organizing that you saw in places like Poland and in Brazil to confront the autocrats there. And I think the court strategy has actually done better than I thought it would. Yes, the Supreme Court did erase a lot of the lower court wins, but the lower court wins ended up mattering a lot in terms of slowing Trump down. And the Supreme Court, recently refused to allow him to deploy the National Guard in Chicago and Portland and Los Angeles. So while I certainly don't think we can count on the Supreme Court, the court strategy has done better than I thought it would. And the political organizing strategy has done worse than I thought it would. It has been extremely difficult to get institutional actors in this country to really lean in on protecting our system. I've been really surprised at how much the institutional actors have caved over and over again. And I think we were wrong to think that they would do better than they did. But then you had that second question, which we should come back to, which is like, what I want to ask you is like, okay, but if we really want to get out of this, right, and we could talk about, we have to understand the drivers. We have to get at the underlying drivers. And I'm curious, kind of what's your current assessment now? You've been thinking about this for a long time. What is driving this moment of illiberalism and authoritarianism around the world? I don't think I've asked you that question in a while. I'd love to hear your current thinking on what the real drivers are.
So I think you're absolutely right that we should break the question out into these three parts. And I think this is in a way all still the pre-conversation, and we'll get into the meat of the conversation from this moment on. And that is, I think, to go systematically through those 3 points. I don't want to lose the first one either, right? So, let's go into a little bit more detail first about, what Trump has actually done over the course of these 10 years and what is happening now. Then we'll turn to what actually are the drivers of this? Why is it Trump? And so many other politicians who in some ways are similar to him, but in many important ways are very similar to him, are riding high in the polls all around the Western world and beyond. And then third, we can sort of double down on what strategies are working, what strategies are not working. I think there's been a great kind of little preview of each of those topics, and we have a time to go into depth on each of them. So let's start with our rueful victory lap, right? Let's start with a thing where we were sadly right. We're recording this a couple of days after it became public that the Department of Justice is investigating Jay Powell for supposed perjury in congressional testimony relating to the renovation of the Federal Reserve. It is striking to me to what extent Donald Trump has used his control over the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies. And in this particular case, it's also striking that he's doing that in the service of trying to increase his hold. In some of these cases, it was mostly to settle political scores, right? It was just people like Letitia James, who he has a deep personal gripe against, and he just, you cross me, I'm going to make you pay, right? In this case, it goes, I think, beyond that, because the animus is really comes from the fact that Donald Trump has a very strong view about what kind of monetary policy he would like the Fed to pursue. He can't directly fire the head of the Federal Reserve, and so it is an attempt to push out the head of the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and to expand his power. It is really an attempt to put in place his loyalists into key parts of the state, the then set policy that he agrees with. So, to me, that is, one recent but very important case of, how Trump is following this playbook, which is first to, use control over the most important levers of the state to intimidate opponents, both the actual political opposition, in this case the Democratic Party, and non-partisan experts and technocrats like Jay Powell, who's no person's idea of a radical Democrat. And then secondly, to put his loyalists into positions of power where they serve his political interests rather than their judgment of what the best economic policy might be, of what interest rate would in the long run be best for the American economy and so on. That's one tiny little microcosm from the recent news about that. To go back to the 2016 question, I think that's what we all predicted. And yet, I think we would have had some trouble really imagining that. I think in 2016, 2017, I absolutely would have said, this is the kind of thing that could eventually happen, but to see it actually play out, to see the extent of the politicization of the judiciary in going after partisan opponents, and the ways in which none of them have yet been actually put in jail, and actually the legal system has been relatively good at throwing out some of those lawsuits and so on. But the extent to which the Department of Justice now is playing ball, that kind of thing, is really quite striking, isn't it?
I was on a call a couple of years ago with some allies in the pro-democracy space and coalition, and was saying that we at Protect Democracy were saying a particular thing was going to happen. And I remember one of the people on the call said, "Wow, you guys are the most paranoid motherfuckers in American politics." And we took it a bit as a badge of honor. Have thought about making T-shirts to say that, but just because you're paranoid don't mean they're not after you. And I think in this case, I'm going to push back again. I am not surprised by even the brazenness of Trump directing the Department of Justice to indict Tish James, James Comey, Jerome Powell. I think it took two terms to be able to get to this point, right? Because in the first term, he wanted to do these things. We had reports out of the administration that he was asking, why can't we go and indict Andy McCabe and Jim Comey? And the problem was that you still had a relatively professionalized Department of Justice and FBI, where even the political appointees that Trump himself put in place, Jeff Sessions, again, like you said of Jerome Powell, nobody's idea of a liberal Democrat, was unwilling to carry out, Trump's orders. And so it took part two of Trump's project, his return to power, where he understood that in order for him to do the things that he wanted to do, he needed total and complete loyalty from the people.
And ironically, losing in 2020 was probably one of the best things that happened to him, because in 2020, I don't think that he had the staff and the laws. It took him 4 years in the wilderness to build on the political appointees of the first term, to write Project 2025, to continue to colonize, the think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, and then to be able to come in with a completely different team in terms of loyalty and competence than what he had in 2016.
And in this way, I actually don't think there's as much of a distinction between the Tish James prosecution and what's being now suggested about going after Jerome Powell. And I suspect you and I might agree on this, that at the end of the day, you could look at them and say, well, with Powell, he's trying to sort of impose his will on an independent Federal Reserve, and with Tish James, he's just simply trying to seek revenge. That's one way of looking at it, sure. But both of them are of a piece with his view that you use the levers of power you have to coerce loyalty, and demonstrate that nobody should cross you, so that everyone does what you want. And I think in that way, they're actually quite similar, right? And one of the ways, for example, that he was able to get the prosecution in New York of Eric Adams dropped was he managed to get the Department of Justice to say to the lawyers in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York who were resisting, we might prosecute you unless you do what we want, right? We will bludgeon you. And so those lawyers ended up, eventually giving up, resigning, to their credit, actually resigning in protest, because it was clear that there was nothing that was going to stop the Trump and his, the people he had installed at the senior levels of the Department of Justice were going after them. And so the prosecution of Tish James and Jim Comey, in one sense, they're revenge, but I think in a greater sense, they are a model of what will happen to you no matter who you are if you cross me. And I've talked about this before. I grew up in New York City in 70s and 80s. It was Donald Trump's era of New York City, and it was also John Gotti's era in New York City. And Trump and Gotti were two of the most dominant characters in the New York City media, in the news, in the tabloids. And Trump watched Gotti very closely, right? And his behavior very much apes the mafia style of behavior, right? Of coercing loyalty, of offering protection for those people who paid tribute. You look at what's going on now with some of these deals where NVIDIA is allowed to sell its chips to China so long as they cut, the government in on a 10% share, or the U.S. Steel has to give Trump sort of the golden share decision making. As long as the Don is paid his tribute, you get protection and you're allowed to operate. Delcy Rodriguez is learning that right now in Venezuela. And if you cross the Don, then cement boots.
Nice chips, shame if something should happen to them.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's a line that people will remember from Goodfellas, where Joe Pesci, I think it's De Niro maybe, is talking about Joe Pesci, and he says the thing about Joe Pesci: if you come at him with a knife, he'll come back with a gun. If you come at him with a gun, you better kill him, because he'll keep coming back. And that's what Roy Cohn essentially taught Donald Trump: that someone comes after you, come back at them twice as hard, and that's how you get your way. And that's obviously fundamentally at odds with the idea of liberal democracy and constitutionalism, but that idea that we just impose our will because we're strong enough, which Stephen Miller recently articulated in defense of what was happening in Venezuela and the threats against Greenland, is the animating ethos of Trumpism. And I think it explains Powell as much as Tish James.
How do we think about what truly matters in this moment and what is less important in terms of what the Trump administration is doing? I mean, to take one example, I think the fact that a sitting president imposes, through legally somewhat dubious means, that one of the most significant cultural institutions in the country should carry his name, renaming the Kennedy Center the Trump Kennedy Center, and making sure that within a day or two the name Trump goes up, above the name Kennedy on the actual building, is absolutely astonishing and striking. We do not have a tradition of sitting presidents naming things after them. We tend to name a lot of things after dead presidents, particularly those who were assassinated, like John F. Kennedy, and in fact the Kennedy Center was named in his honor a few months after his death. But there's just no precedent for a sitting president to say, I'm going to name this in my own name. You know, when you look at the fact that there was free entry to national parks on Martin Luther King Day, and Donald Trump canceled that free entry and made entry free instead on Donald Trump Day, which is to say his birthday. You know, those things are astonishing. And at the same time, you know, with, you know, a sort of slightly cold-blooded look, you might say, well, that is a distraction, right? Who cares what the Kennedy Center is called? Who cares when people get to have free entry to the national parks? The stuff that really matters is things like those prosecutions of political opponents, like, you know, the sort of building up of various paramilitary forces that have intense personal loyalty to Trump and can exert influence on streets of American cities and so on. You know, how do we think about some of those softer things, right, which outrage and which do seem to build towards something like a personality cult and also seem in some light to be more of a distraction versus the things that, from the perspective of democratic theory, have more obvious significance? And you know, you've built a formidable organization over the course of the last 10 years, but you have limited resources as well. How do you think about which of these kinds of things do you respond to? Which of these kind of things should my listeners care about when they read about them in the news? And which of those things, I mean, you know, go scream in the void a little bit, you know, have a beer that helps calm you down, but forget about it and focus on something else?
Yeah, well, first, we're building a pantheon of people that Donald Trump is copying. We named John Gotti, maybe Joe Pesci's character in Goodfellas. The one that comes to mind with respect to what you're saying is Caligula, if you recall, the Roman emperor who had people cut the heads off of statues of, you know, sort of formerly revered Roman figures in order to put his own head on those statues. So, like, let's add
Thank God Donald Trump doesn't own a horse, so far as I know.
That's right. But your question gets at one of the hardest things that we have to wrestle with at an organization dedicated to preventing the U.S. from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. As you know, we have limited resources. How do we focus them? And I will say one of the things that we recently went through over the last couple of months was really putting the screws to ourselves on answering this question, because as we've seen, Steve Bannon and Donald Trump have talked about this idea of flooding the zone, of shock and awe, of doing so many things at once that in really kind of a strategy that borrows from some of the great military theorists of the past. Sun Tzu talks about this. If you can spread your opponent's defenses thin enough, it becomes easier to defeat them. And I think there's a very deliberate strategy here on Trump's part, which is, you know, to be attacking constant action on all fronts in order to create this challenge of dividing those of us who want to defend a vision of American democracy and freedom that we would like to hand off to the next generation, where we become so split and distracted with everything we're fighting on that we become net weaker. And I think that so at the organization at Protect Democracy, we do a lot of litigating, as I mentioned, to sort of, you know, hold the line. We do a lot of legislative work. We're doing work we can come to a little later on right now, helping states pass laws under state law that would allow people to hold federal officials for constitutional violations accountable under state law, like the horrific shooting of Renee Good that we saw in Minneapolis. We do legislative advocacy. We do technology work. We build software. So we have a lot of things that we do, and we can't do everything. And in fact, if we try to do everything, we will be net weaker for it. And so I think that is not to say that the naming of the Kennedy Center as the Trump Kennedy Center is not important. I do think it's important for reasons you and I would both appreciate, which is this sort of cultural dominance, that there's nowhere you can look where I am not the center of attention and that I do not control. There's a reason why these personalist emperors, dictators, autocrats do this. It's a way of demonstrating total domination in terms of bringing opposition to heel, right? Saddam's got his statues everywhere. He's always watching you. He hovers over everything that you do. It is important, but we have to order what we're going after. And the thing that I think, and that we at Protect Democracy are focused on as the highest order priority, is protecting the integrity of American elections. The midterm elections that are coming up later this year, and then ultimately the 2028 election. You participated at an event we did in 2017, an initial summit for democracy, right after Trump had been elected. We brought people together from across the political spectrum in Washington to sort of preview what we were in for. And you moderated a panel on which the Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza spoke. And I don't know if you remember this, but you at the end of the panel, you asked each of the panelists if they had one piece of advice from, and the panelists all had worked in autocratic countries, if they had one piece of advice from their experience for those of us in America who were about to get up a window into what it's like to live in a country that is losing its democracy. And I remember Vlad's answer, and Vlad said, you know, you don't know yet in the United States who is going to win your next election. In Russia, we do. So you are not where we are yet. And hold really tight to that thing that you have, that you do not yet know who's going to win the next election. And I think Vlad's insight there was that, like, at the end of the day, the thing about democracy is, so long as there are regular opportunities for the public to choose whether to continue down this road or pivot to a different one, you have an escape valve. You have the ability to correct. That's the great thing about democracy, the ability to self-correct. And that is, at the end of the day, the sine qua non element. There's a lot of other elements that contribute to that. We could talk about, you know, what are the effects of different things that are happening to the ability to, like, meaningfully contest an election and protect an election. But at the end of the day, so long as we don't know who's going to win the next election, and we have a meaningful opportunity and a fair process to contest it and have someone else potentially win and have that win be honored, there's a lot of stuff in there that we got to protect, we have the ability to survive this. And so I think you start, and that is our approach to protect democracy, is everything goes to the number one question, which is how do we make sure that we maintain the ability to have a free and fair election, the ability to fairly contest that election, which involves more than just making sure people can vote on election day or in the weeks leading up to it. It means making sure that people can actually organize and argue and debate and criticize and receive information and share information and all of those things, and then that the winners actually get seated. Everything that we can do to protect that, that's the priority. And anything that isn't, the further afield all these horrific things that are going on that are wildly inappropriate and offensive and problematic and important, the further afield they are from that, I think, unfortunately, probably the lower down the priority ladder of where we can devote our limited resources, they will receive.
I have a thought and a question. The thought is just that it's been a very eventful decade for all of us, but especially for Vladimir, who courageously went back to Russia to fight against Vladimir Putin there, was quickly taken prisoner, spent a long time in jail, was finally released somewhat recently, and is now back to fighting for a democratic future in Russia. And I saw him spoke about the experience, about his hopes for Russia last summer, and he was as impressive as ever. The question I have is, where are we at with election security in the United States now, and with Donald Trump's ability to subvert elections? His willingness to do so, I think, is quite clear. In 2016, an election he won, he kept claiming that actually there had been massive voter fraud in California and other places, and he had won in the popular vote despite reports to the contrary in the lying press. In 2020, obviously, he did try to subvert the outcome of the election and to impede a peaceful transfer of power. He managed to impede it happening peacefully, but it did not manage to impede it happening. Joe Biden was able to take office on January 20th, 2021. We now have a set of midterm elections coming up in which, despite their own unpopularity, the Democrats look relatively likely to win the House of Representatives according to current polls and prediction markets. To what extent do you think Donald Trump is going to be able to subvert those midterm elections? Where are we at in this process?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's start with the good news, which is our election system in the U.S. has been remarkably resilient. We have had unbelievably successful elections in very difficult circumstances. In 2020, during the pandemic, we had a remarkably successful free and fair election. Donald Trump lost that election, as you noted, tried all manner of efforts to overturn that result and was effectively thwarted kind of at every turn and failed. And then a 2024 election that also was remarkably successful. Donald Trump won that election, but that election was successful. And then we've had off-year elections in 2025, et cetera. The election system has held up remarkably well, and I think one reason is because of the original Federalist design, which is that it's highly decentralized. We don't have really one election in this country. We have thousands of small local elections that all ladder up to a national election. And I think that Federalist design has really protected us. Were we to have a situation in this country in which there were sort of a national electoral apparatus that ran our elections, that would be much easier for Donald Trump to capture and control in the way that he has, for example, the Department of Justice and other aspects of our federal machinery. And so I think...
Yeah, just briefly, one of the times I most disagreed with a friend of mine is when he publicly suggested that we should build a good national electoral, institution that is going to have all the best practices and so on. And I thought that is lunacy, right? I mean, the fact that American elections are so decentralized certainly allows for shenanigans here or there. It allows for simple technocratic failures like the famous hanging chads in Florida. It can lead to all kinds of problems, but it also makes it incredibly hard to take over in a centralized way. In a place like Hungary, there's, 9 people or 7 people, or however many on the National Electoral Commission. If you manage to have a majority on that committee, you can do all kinds of shenanigans throughout the country, driven by the center. Thank God that there's not one National Electoral Committee into, which Donald Trump can pack either through ordinary means, because, every president gets to appoint new people every 2 years or something like that, or through some kind of extraordinary step of measures, and then run the elections centrally from within the control of the White House. That would be dangerous as the current situation is, much, much, much more dangerous.
I mean, look, we could fill many episodes of The Good Fight talking about the ways in which the modern Republican Party has contributed to the mess that we're in right now. But one place where we can at least give Mitch McConnell some credit, and I hope the Republican Party will continue to, is McConnell has been a strong supporter of the decentralized federalist nature of our election system and resisted efforts to sort of build more national structure into it. And so, at least at this moment, hopefully he and his allies will continue to stand firm for that, because Donald Trump is going to try to bring more of the electoral apparatus under his control. So let's talk about where we are and what's going to happen. So first off, I mentioned that we had a bunch of successful elections over the last couple of years. That didn't happen accidentally. It wasn't magic. There was a lot of effort put in to protecting our electoral system, making sure it could work, defending against Trump's attacks on it. It is going to require all of those efforts again. And I think in each of the prior elections, it helped to know what he was going to do, right? We knew in 2020, for example, that he was going to claim that the initial ballots that got counted, which were the day of Election Day ballots that were going to show him ahead because of the distribution of who voted on Election Day and who voted by mail, was going to be the only valid result. And they called that the red mirage. It was going to look like he was ahead. And then over time, as the mail ballots got counted and the urban centers got counted, which tend to take longer, which was going to be more of sort of where Joe Biden's vote totals were going to come from, the outcome was going to appear to shift on the bottom of your screen when you're watching them update, and that Trump was going to claim that that was fraudulent, that was an election being stolen. And because we knew about that in advance, we knew that was going to be his plan, and the American people could understand and expect that, it helped inoculate us against that. And so I think it's important to know what's coming. So here's what I think is coming this year, which is Trump has already been claiming that there's rampant fraud in our elections. He is going to double and triple down on it. The Department of Justice sent monitors to California and New Jersey during the 2025 elections. There was an initial concern that they were going to try to interfere in vote counting. That was not our view. They were not there to interfere. What they were there to do, in our view, was to basically give themselves a basis and a predicate to come out several months later during 2026 and say, we went to California, New Jersey, and we saw fraud everywhere, right? Expect that they're going to come out with a report saying we saw fraud everywhere. There have been some bananas conspiracy theories. Sidney Powell floated them in 2020 that American voting machines were infected by Venezuela. That was considered crazy at the time.
Perhaps that is why Donald Trump wanted to remove Nicolas Maduro from power in Caracas, to take control of those voting machines.
That's right, that Maduro stole the 2020 election. Yeah, so I mean, no, I don't think that is what drove the decision to invade Venezuela, but I do think they're going to take advantage of it. I do think you're going to see Delcy Rodriguez or some other senior person in Venezuela under pressure from the Trump administration come forward and say, yes, Venezuela did interfere in the 2020 election. Trump is going to spend the next couple of months building a predicate case that American elections are rife with fraud, foreign interference, can't be trusted, in order to justify a federal attempted takeover and to get other actors to do things that he wants. It's a little bit like the play you're seeing in Minnesota right now, where they're going to say, oh, there's rampant fraud there. We got to take away all the money. We got to send the forces in, right? You build a predicate and then you sort of send the forces in. I think you're going to see Trump try to intervene more in the electoral apparatus on the basis of these claims. And just to be clear, you and I know this, but every real effort, every legitimate effort to look into claims of fraud in American elections find that it is vanishingly small, right? That the number of fraudulent voters or people who shouldn't be voting is unimaginably small and orders of magnitude less than what it would take to actually raise questions about. Like, you're talking about like what the Heritage Foundation, the biggest champion of this, posted something on their website a couple of years ago cataloging all the cases of fraud that have been found around the country, and you're talking about numbers in the like 2 digits, right? 12 cases of it, just absurdly small numbers in a country this size, and small enough that it has absolutely zero impact on the outcome of elections. But Trump is going to try to run that play. And so right now, according to Pew surveys, about 77% of Americans think that, elections reflect the actual what happened, the will of the voters. When Trump tried to say right after 2020 that election was stolen, he only convinced about, 28-ish%. If those numbers hold, he's not going to be able to disrupt these elections. But if he is able to really meaningfully change those numbers, if he is able to use his grip on the MAGA faithful and the Republican Party to shift it to where you've got, 50% of Americans say you could trust elections, 50% say you can't, then we're in trouble. Because then I think he's going to be able to get all these apparatchiks around the country, the people like Brad Raffensperger, who bravely resisted in 2020, to then start to have a basis to say, well, maybe we got to do X, Y, or Z. And when he starts to basically say no federal funds for Ohio unless they, quote unquote, clean up their voter rolls and get rid of everybody on the voter rolls with names that sound like they have Hispanic origins, it's going to be very hard for him to convince the Mike DeWines of the world to do that, unless he shifts the public narrative such that DeWine feels politically, maybe I got to do something here. And so I think the ballgame initially is going to be not allowing him to make up a phony narrative that elections can't be trusted, when Republicans should know, who won the last major national election in 2024? Donald Trump. Mike Johnson became the speaker. Why? Because the elections worked.
So I want to get back to the outlook for what to expect in the midterms and for the next about 3 years of Donald Trump's second presidency at the end of the conversation. But perhaps this is a good moment to shift into the second question that we said we would try to answer, which is about what the causes of this political moment are. I know pretty much what I thought in 2016, 2017, because I was, working very intensely on the People versus Democracy at the time. And, there's a whole part of that book that tried to explain the causes. And what I said at the time is that there's 3 kind of structural transformations that have happened in the background, which help to explain why people are satisfied with democracy, why there's this kind of rise of discontent. And that was, the rise of the internet and of social media, which allows people to bypass gatekeepers, makes it easier for new entrants to come onto the political scene, also makes it easier to polarize the public and say things that would have been too outrageous to print or to put on TV in the past and so on. There is a set of economic changes, most notably the fact that we no longer live in the period, which I think in retrospect really was an extraordinary period, of extremely rapid economic growth and increase in living standards, after World War II, which really pacified the United States and other countries, which really made a lot of citizens think my living standards are increasing so much faster, I'm doing so much better than my parents were, my kids are going to do so much better than me, that they kind of gave the system the benefit of a doubt. And people no longer feel that, even if actually America has done somewhat well economically over the last 30 or so years. And then finally, it's just a very rapid set of cultural and demographic changes, which has led some sections of the population to decline in social status in ways that they are rebelling against. I would say that two things about that. I guess I would give myself 5 out of 10 on that or something like that. I think that some of the structural factors certainly were at play, that everything I said there is roughly speaking correct. I do wonder whether I was insufficiently attuned to some of the legitimate grievances that people have with our broader culture and political system. To, for example, the way in which America in particular is just deeply dominated by a kind of professional managerial elite that has come to be deeply out of touch with the rest of the country and often to look down on the rest of the country in quite important ways. These are all lovely people. These are all the people, like you and me, the people in our social circles, right? And a lot of them are hugely competent. They often did get to their positions in life through a series of meritocratic competitions in which they did truly excel. And yet it is striking to me in what a separate world they live to ordinary people. I mean, I think there is just a broader set of failures of elite institutions over the last 20 years. I mean, you can call that 9/11, the response to 9/11, the financial crisis in 2008, the failure to grapple in Europe, for example, with how complicated something like the wave of migration around 2015 would be on the ground in real ways that it affected people. And then, of course, the pandemic and the failure of institutions like the CDC that promised year after year that they're going to stop us, they're going to stop those kind of pandemics and they're going to be rational guides if it does happen. To do as well as they could. And when I look at all of that, I guess, as the first part of this conversation makes very clear, I have not a single positive word to say about Donald Trump and think that what he's doing to democratic institutions is extremely dangerous. I guess I have a little bit more sympathy perhaps than I would have had for 2016 and 2017 for voters who are saying, you guys, things are working for you, you have good lives. Yeah. If you have a nice master's degree from a good university and a nice professional job in New York or LA or Chicago, right? You kind of look down on me. You say I have to respect these institutions, and I kind of get it sort of, but also these institutions kind of screwed up a lot over the last 20 years. And I think that I would have dismissed this way of thinking about the world perhaps a little bit too easily 10 years ago. And I worry that perhaps we still don't fully grapple with that as being, one of the roots of what's happening at the moment. So I'm wondering, I've been talking for a little bit, but I wonder what your feeling on this is, what your reaction to this is.
I mean, for the sake of a good podcast, I would like to disagree, except I can't. I pretty much agree with everything you just said. And so, when I look at, I have in front of me a little set of notes I was taking the other day in a conversation like this where I was also talking about kind of what are the drivers of this moment, because if we don't understand the drivers, we don't know how to actually reverse it. And literally the list I had, and I'm looking at my notes as you're speaking, the first one was tech, the new innovations that in communications and technology that we have not yet fully metabolized as a society. And I think this is the number one. And you listed it number one, and I listed number one. The reason I listed number one, I think, is because if you look at what's happening in the United States, and you've written about this, it is not just happening in the United States. It is happening across Western Europe. It is happening in places in South America. It's happening in a way across the world that suggests that something beyond some of the unique domestic dynamics has to be at play. And I think the best answer for what that has affected all of human sort of society and civilization has been these radical changes in how we share information and understand reality and make truth and communicate. And so I agree with you. That is,
and one very brief way to think about this from a perspective of comparative politics, and I've only kind of hit upon this formulation of it relatively recently, is that when I teach this material now, I tell my students, any explanation for the rise of populism needs to pass 3 kinds of tests. The first is the temporal test, right? Why now? You can't explain a change from a constant. The second is the geographic test, right? A lot of the kind of explanations they give, like the economic stagnation one, which I think does help to explain why Michigan voted the way it did in 2016 in certain kind of respects, but it doesn't work very well for Poland or India or all kinds of other countries where populists have risen a lot in the last 20 years that are vastly more affluent than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So they kind of don't pass the geographic test. And then there's a kind of phenomenological test, right? There's a test about, is the energy in our political system where you would expect it to be given the nature of the explanation? And that's, I think, also one problem for the economic explanation, because I think a lot of people would like to think, well, it's because of inequality and so on, but then why aren't the left-wing populists winning, right? Why is it mostly the right-wing populists who are winning? And so, I don't think social media explains everything, but I do think that it is the one that most obviously passes the temporal, the geographic, and the phenomenological test.
Which is why we both have it as number 1. And then number 2, I have, as you did, sort of the economic trends, which, notwithstanding what you just said, you did note as the second one. And obviously, and I think you put it well, which is it's experiential as much as it is actual economic data, which is how do people feel about it. And there's all sorts of interesting psychological research about whether someone feels better about their own well-being if they have more on net total than someone else, but are more further distance from their neighbors, right? You could actually have net more, but be further distance from your neighbors and be more upset than someone who has net less, right? And I think those are some of the dynamics at play. You mentioned the cultural one, and look, you located the cultural one specifically, and maybe this was just speaking quickly in our current conversation, in kind of the contest for power coming from groups that have historically been excluded. That is a piece of it, but I think there's more going on culturally. That is definitely an element. There's more going on culturally than just that. There is a, if you look at Lindsey Graham, posted something the other day wishing a happy birthday to Rand Paul. And the post was a schoolyard taunt, right? I forget what it said, but it was something sort of the way that kids in the schoolyard try to like one-up each other with your mama jokes. Like Lindsey Graham was basically doing a your mama joke on Rand Paul to be like, look at me, everyone in the schoolyard. I can do a better your mama joke than somebody else. Something is happening culturally where that is a incentivized demonstration of behavior in a way that was not before. And that is not something that's just about, who's contesting for power. There's something else happening there that maybe it's the unique incentives that Donald Trump is creating, but you're seeing them coming from other. I mean, Elon Musk is doing it too, and I think you see it in some of the European leaders. Not the same. Boris Johnson behaved a little bit that way. So there's something about the sort of coarsening and erosion of culture going on. So we had those 3. The 2 that you did mention that I just want to add in there, and one partly fails some of your tests, and so we've disagreed about this. I think there are structural elements, at least in the United States context, that might not be total explanations for what's going on because they don't cross geological boundaries, but are clearly contributing to some of the incentives. I mean, if you think, just to give one example here, the number one policy issue in the U.S. that I think explains this moment is immigration, right? Donald Trump rode immigration to the White House twice. We are in large part in the U.S. in this boat because both George Bush and Barack Obama tried to figure out a way of solving some of the immigration policy challenges and were thwarted. And George Bush, in his memoir, Decision Points, wrote that the reason he was unable to pass comprehensive immigration reform was because of the problem of gerrymandering in this country and the fact that there were people within his own party and the other party that only had to worry about running in primaries and therefore were pulled to their extremist bases and refused any sort of compromise. Barack Obama ran into the same problem. And Bush said in the memoir, if any future president wants to solve the problem of governing in this country, they have to solve this gerrymandering problem. We are now in a situation where Joe Biden pulled immigration wildly to one extreme. That failed miserably. And Donald Trump is now pulling immigration wildly to the other extreme, and that is going to fail miserably. I mean, there's a new poll out as of the time of us recording this that for the first time ever, more people in the American public support the proposition of abolish ICE than oppose it. That's a remarkable, almost a 30-point swing in that question. Trump's immigration agenda is wildly unpopular. And so he is going to find, I think, that just as Joe Biden's immigration position was unpopular, so we've gone in this country from two presidents of both different parties who tried to find compromise and failed, and then two presidents who tried to go to the extremes and are going to have that fail. There are structural dynamics that are causing this failure. And, Viktor Orban, in trying to figure out how to cement control over a Hungarian population that was not 60% plus in favor of his agenda, looked at the U.S. gerrymandering system and adopted aspects of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think you do have some structural dynamics that might not explain the whole global situation, but you look at some of the challenges in the U.S. and there are some structural problems causing it. And then the last piece I would add is leaders. I think the story of American politics over the last 20 years can be told by talking about two leaders, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. They've pretty much dominated American politics for the last 20 years. And I think that the next era of American politics, a lot of the story is not just going to be how do we respond to the things we've identified, but who is the leader and what is the force of their personality. Now, I think we have to do work on the tech issue, on making sure that the new tech tools that are coming online empower democracy rather than authoritarianism. And I think that the danger is that these new artificial intelligence tools are much better friends to an authoritarian approach than a democratic approach. That's going to take effort. We have to do work on the economic front. That's going to take effort. We have to do work on the cultural front. That's going to take effort. And on the structural front, that's going to take effort. The leader problem will largely solve itself because the market will demand leaders that meet the moment, and they will emerge as they do across the world. The one other thing, though, that you said that I did want to make an additional point on is you talked about how you have come to appreciate more in the intervening years since you wrote The People vs. Democracy, the legitimacy of some of the critiques of the governing class. I agree with you. And I would say what's interesting about it is that assessment is actually consistent from left to right. You can look at articulations on the left in America of what ails us and see criticisms of sort of the governing elite failing. And if you look at you read Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, very, very similar critique. There are different prescriptions, even Steve Bannon. But the critique that something has fundamentally gone wrong in terms of how the governing elite in the U.S. have managed their responsibilities to, because there's always going to be, to some extent, a governing elite, how a governing elite manages responsibilities to the rest of the country. Something's gone wrong there, and I think that both the left and the right have identified it. And the one book that I think really got this right early on was Chris Hayes' Twilight of the Elites, which I think is an unsung, really prescient look at the failures of the meritocratic elite and the rebellion that it was engendering. And until we figure out how to reset there's going to be elites in society. What is the role they play? We're going to be unfinished in coming up with how we solve this problem.
So a few thoughts on this. I mean, on the structural issue, I agree with your semi-endorsement of that explanation. Clearly, America's political system have some quite particular features which have some quite particular problems. The mixture between the primary system and the gerrymandered constituencies and districts is quite a unique problem. So that can't explain everything, because you have lots of countries that have somewhat similar populist figures and similar forms of populists rising, that don't have America's majoritarian political system, that don't have gerrymandering, therefore, that don't have primaries. And yet, I think it clearly is a big part of what makes it's so hard to overcome the depolarization in our politics in the United States. And so, I think if you want to lean everything on that, it's going to fail. But if you want to think of that as one of the deeply contributing factors to why you are unable to solve something like, immigration policy and the really terrible downstream consequences that has, I absolutely agree that that is one key part of the explanation.
So, Yascha, this is actually one of the points that we have disagreed on over the years, and so I'm glad we found some middle ground on this, that it may not be the be-all, end-all explanation. I agree with you there. It can't explain what's happening globally, but it is clearly a problem in the United States that needs some...
It's a contributing factor, for sure, yeah.
It's a contributing factor.
Did I change my mind about that? I would have thought that I had said that in the past, but perhaps I changed my mind about realizing, or perhaps we just formulated it right this time.
Maybe we formulated it right, but I'm going to take it as a victory because, we've agreed on so much over the years and even on this show, but this has been one of the points, I think, of tension between our approaches. I think we've found a formulation that works for both of us, and I'm going to say it's a good victory.
We'll take that. Yeah. Well, and what's striking is how hard it is that the electoral incentives, where a majority of members of the House are just much more at risk from a more ideologically hardcore member of their own political party and being primaried than they are of losing their seat in a general election, then makes it impossible to reach policies and even to speak a language that appeals to the majority of the population. And I do think that this is the other point of culture that I've probably underestimated. You're right to call out my framing around sort of people who feel that their status is threatened. I wanted to put it in the way that I put it in the book, back in 2017, 2018, and that is the language I would have used. I think nowadays I would add that also a lot of people had some reasonable grounds to be upset about some of the practices and some of the language of major American institutions, and really being made to feel and sometimes being treated like they don't matter, because they're not part of some favored group that is in the good graces of certain parts of the progressive movement. And that, I think, unnecessarily aggravated some of those fears and concerns that perhaps pre-existed below that. But what's really striking is the coexistence of still a majority of Americans who I think have quite reasonable views and who are quite responsive to actual events on the ground, right? Who, when they see Joe Biden pursuing policies that effectively create an open border with Mexico, say that is not what we want and run the other direction. Then when they see the way in which Donald Trump is deporting people who have been upstanding members of the communities for many decades and sending ICE agents to wreak havoc in American cities, they say, well, that's certainly not what we want either. And sort of striking to what extent we've just kept being unable to have a politics that speaks to what I still think is actually a reasonable majority of American citizens. But the last thing I want to hit on before we move to the next part of our self-examination is the point which you started. It does feel as though something has just fundamentally changed and shifted in our culture in such a way that something has just broken and it's unclear that we're going to be able to go back, right? When I think of the America I immigrated into in 2007, with, in some ways it's appealing and in some ways it's silly, forms of respectability, with its relative stuffiness, with its absurd scandals about Barack Obama wearing a tan suit, at some event. It just feels like that is just gone for good. And there are probably some good things about that. I remember being shocked on my very first trip to the United States by seeing some pretty graphic documentary about people dying of drug overdoses, but somebody said shit or fuck, that was beeped out. And I thought, you're showing me people dying on screen, right? But when they say shit, you beep it out. To me as a European, it was incomprehensible. And so there's elements of that old culture that I think were weird and ill-adjusted and probably didn't make sense. But it was also a form of respectability which stood behind the relative respect that George W. Bush and Barack Obama had for each other, despite their profound political differences, right? And I just think, there's something, whether it's social media or a broader set of developments, that has just destroyed that world. And I guess I don't know whether that form of norms of mutual respect and perhaps of moderation that came with it is ever going to come back, and whether we should try and make it come back or just hold a somewhat rueful funeral for it, a funeral of mixed emotions, and embrace the fact that we just live in a different world forever.
Well, my fear, and I don't know if this is optimism or not, is that the only way those things get built over time is out of necessity, that they tend to grow out of a society saying, well, we need a level of respectful dialogue and peaceful navigation of differences because we tried the alternative, which was a descent into conflict and violence, and that was miserable. And so we're going to build some alternative, and we're going to build a system for maintaining the alternative. And so I agree with you that those things are very hard to build and very easy to destroy. And, Trump in many ways, he's an effective destroyer. He is not an effective builder. And so he's destroyed a lot very quickly, just as a wrecking ball can destroy a building very fast. It's very hard to reconstruct it. And I think this is one where it's not going to get reconstructed easily or quickly. And unfortunately, it will, if it gets reconstructed, some form of, I don't know how it's described other than sort of social order, right? It's because people want it. And they want it because the alternative was intolerable. And I worry that we are still in the descent of how we communicate with one another, how we treat one another, what our values are. They're being eroded still, and they will continue probably to go down until they, and in some ways, maybe justifiably so, right? To your point about, well, did it really make sense to show a video of people dying, but to bleep out the shit? And I think that analogy you could project out into a whole bunch of other places where we built social constructs and ways of talking to each other and certain norms that probably papered over, in the way bleeping that shit papered over the fact that something even more horrific was happening, but we were focused on the wrong thing, papered over some really horrible actual policies and structural designs that were elevating some parts of society, keeping others out, and we were distracted by saying, yeah, but what's the language that we use, or how do we talk about this? And I think it's going to take a fundamental reordering and probably a descent into something that we find intolerable before we say, hey, let's build not just a better structural order, in terms of our political design and our economics, but then also perhaps a way of maintaining that order through the way that we talk about it, treat each other, refer to each other, that grows like a phoenix from the ashes, but that means everything burns. And Trump is certainly burning it down. And I think, the actual human damage that's being done is the tragedy. And I think we probably both want to see that tragedy end sooner rather than later. And I'm just worried about what it's going to take to get us all to recommit to a shared national project together.
Right, we're coming to the third part of our self-reckoning, which is our thoughts about what to do. You have, I think with great clarity and foresight, built an organization that has made a big fight in the preservation for these political norms and institutions. As you're saying, some of the things that we're focused on from the beginning, like protecting electoral institutions, are clearly important. I would love to hear a little bit more about what you were saying regarding the courts. That was part of a strategy from the beginning. I've actually, among a lot of bad news, been somewhat heartened by the fact that in my reading, the Supreme Court so far has acted a little bit better than at least some commentators suggest. It seems to me that, roughly speaking, if you looked at the publications of the Federalist Society in 2014, before Donald Trump entered politics, they would have predicted where the Supreme Court landed on at least a lot of their rulings. And when it comes to actions by Trump that clearly run counter to the spirit of what the Federalist Society would have believed in 2014 or go well beyond it. Trump didn't lose in every case, but he did lose in a number of cases, and that's related to your point that actually litigation has perhaps still worked somewhat well. I guess I also remember some things that I suggested you do, and to some extent you did, that in retrospect I would find to be quite naive. I remember there was being this idea that if we get lots of letters from people who are consummate professionals, who are not partisan Democrats, who have a reputation for being above the board, and they all say, as members of the security community or as members of the FBI as federal prosecutors, we think that this is dangerous and anomalous. A lot of the kind of like old-fashioned Republicans who liked Mitt Romney and liked George W. Bush would recognize, hang on a second, Trump is anomalous, and this is not just ordinary politics, and that would be a wake-up call, and that might be the thing that takes Trump from, retaining the support grudgingly at the time of all of the Republican coalition to really being deserted by it. And so, that is the kind of thing we need to do in order to stop him from being able to make it. That, in retrospect, just seems hopelessly naive to me. So let's go back to our conversation 2016, 2017, as best you remember, and think through, what parts held up and what parts turned out to be naive in that kind of way.
Well, look, I think that stuff is not working now. I think there were ways in which it worked back in the first term. And just politically, the coalition that turned Trump out of power in 2020 was a relatively broad coalition that did include a lot of former Republicans who were disgusted by Trump and would never have voted Democrat before that. And creating a permission structure for them to do that was part of what worked in the 2017 to 2020 period. But I would agree with you that strategy has long since run really its course, because at the end of the day right now, it is not institutions, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, and leaders who are bravely out there opposing what's happening. No, the more powerful you are, I think at this point in time, the more likely it is over the last year that you have somehow debased yourself and collaborated. No, where you're really seeing pushback is with Americans, people in communities across this country who are not being intimidated or coming out. So I think the Americans are showing us that looking to leaders and institutions as the bulwark was the wrong place to look. That looking at the first three words of the Constitution, we the people, is where you're going to get courage. And so in terms of where we go from here, I think the work of groups like ours is to join with people doing that work and lead the way in a number of ways. So one, the courts. You mentioned the courts. They are still making a difference. We recently were litigating against the abuses of ICE and CBP in Chicago and got a tremendous opinion in the district court there that unfortunately really presaged what we saw happen in Minneapolis recently, where the judge said that CBP and ICE are violating the law, lying to the courts, can't be trusted, and are engaging in abuses of use of force and power kind of pretty rampantly, and that really did presage what happened in Minneapolis. And so now, we're talking to some of the officials around the country who are bringing more cases like that. We just saw Chicago and Illinois file a case sort of, very following the playbook that we laid out in the earlier case there. So I think there's Norm Eisen and his group, the Democracy Defenders Fund, have a report out this week showing that Trump has actually lost about 66% the case that have been litigated over things he's been doing. 84%, I think, was the number if you include some of the immigration cases. He's really getting walloped in the courts, including by judges that he put on the court in a lot of contexts. The other place is legislative advocacy. So I mentioned earlier, we've been working with legislators around the country to pass bills in states that would allow people to hold federal officials accountable for constitutional violations. Governor Hochul in New York deserves a lot of credit. In her State of the State speech this week, she is going to be prioritizing that bill in New York, which has been introduced by Senator Myrie and Assemblymember Romero. We have a similar bill pending in California that we're working with Senator Wiener on. And there's several other states that are moving these bills forward. There's a lot of good work being done on the technological front. to really help support officials around the country in protecting elections. We've got a software called Vote Shield that helps protect elections. We just launched something called the AI for Democracy Action Lab to make sure, as I alluded to earlier, that we win the battle of how this new technology does. And the way all this comes together is that I think what you see across the world in countries that survive moments like this is there are leading tip-of-the-spear actors, the people marching on the streets in Minneapolis and Chicago, the groups that we work with that do this stuff, that pierce the veil of invincibility, right? That show that the emperor really has no clothes and that what they're doing is fundamentally unpopular and can be opposed. And once they do that, if you can build a broad enough coalition of like-minded citizens to come together with them from across different divides, once those tip-of-the-spear actors have shown that the water is warm, it's okay, it's safe, come in, then that gives the institutions the confidence to not be afraid and to feel like the people are with them and the winds are with them. And then institutions all of a sudden can perform their checking role. Because without that public support, the institutions fall prey to the fear of, well, maybe I also need to step back and stop checking power. And that's how consolidation happens. But once those institutions feel that the public wind is with them, and they can, and you're seeing it now with Republicans in Congress who no heroes, right? No heroes, but who are starting to get a little bit of a spine. Why? Because the public has turned on the administration. The Trump administration, you mentioned earlier that a lot of these populists are popular in the polls around the world. And certainly that's true in India. And certainly you see the challengers, this is important, the challengers in Western Europe, whether it's Bardella or whether
that's mostly who I had in mind in Britain and France.
The challengers in Western Europe are probably AfD, but the incumbents are not. Incumbency is an albatross these days because of the changes we're going through, and Trump is not popular, wildly unpopular. And so I think that once you see that the people rise up against and the administrative project is unpopular, then you start to see, and we're seeing it now more than we've seen it recently, Republicans starting to break ranks because the public is not on their side. And that's how you really turn the tide on these things. And then you preserve the ability, this is the North Star, as I said, in elections for people to choose a different course. And as long as we can do that, I think the American people will begin to lead our way out of it. I don't think we're out of the broader global problem. We can maybe end on talking a little bit about that, but I do have confidence that we will survive. I have more confidence today than I had a year ago that we are going to survive Trump's attempt to Orbanize America.
That is an optimistic note to nearly end on. I was going to push you a little bit on that question. We talked so much about our predictions around 2016, 2017. The natural question is to try and predict the next decade. My fear for the last months has been that, as you're saying, it doesn't feel like Trump is managing to take control of public opinion in the United States, which is a good thing. It doesn't feel like he is managing to impose himself on the country in a way where criticism of him becomes rare or impossible. It doesn't feel like we're headed towards what Hungary looks like under Viktor Orban. And certainly it looks as though Democrats are likely at least to win back the House of Representatives in the midterms. I even think it's relatively likely that Democrats will win the presidential elections in 2028, for of course they're far too far out to predict that with any degree of certainty. What I worry about is that this impossibility of incumbents to rule in keeping with the desires of the majority of the population, and the fact that incumbents very quickly own everything that people are unhappy about, will plague Democrats just as much in 2028 as it's plagued Democrats in 2020, and in fact as it has plagued this Trump administration. And so
every incumbent leader in power pretty much almost anywhere around the world.
Yeah. But then the question is, to get out of this political era, we need either for the Republican Party to reform itself fundamentally, which looks more distant than ever, or for Democrats to win crushing majorities for long enough that it forces the Republican Party to completely change itself and come back to a negotiating table. I just don't see either of those things in the offing at all. Democrats are ahead in the polls. They're also at record levels of unpopularity when you ask people just about their perceptions of the Democratic Party. And so I worry that the next democratic administration will look a little bit like Keir Starmer's government in Britain. But 6 months, 12 months into being in office, it starts to be super unpopular, and then we get Tucker Carlson or J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr. take office in 2032. Now that's far too far in the future to predict with any kind of certainty, but I just, what do you think, and I know we don't have much time left in this conversation, what do you think is likely to happen in the next 3 years, and what do you think is likely to happen in the next 10 years, and how is it that we can actually get out of this political era?
Well, look, I want to build on what you're saying, and I think, maybe end with what is going to be teeing up the next episode where we will talk about this. Good
welcome back anytime, Ian.
Good to put a cliffhanger in here. We'll continue on season 2 or season 3, or at this point it's like season 9 for us. But look, I think we are likely to survive, the United States is likely to survive Trump's attempt to consolidate authoritarian control and turn us into an Orban-esque government. What I don't think we are likely to do in the short term is survive the broader dynamics that we've spent the last hour plus talking about. And that's not just about what you just alluded to, which is the possibility that if a Democrat were to win, that they will quickly become unpopular. I agree that's a piece of it. But just that our social order is crumbling around us, both within countries domestically and internationally and geopolitically, that we are descending into a moment that looks and feels an awful lot like the beginnings of the 20th century, where back then, a gilded age of inequality, changes in communication technologies upended social order and led to massive global conflict and suffering until we suffered our way through that and then decided to build something, the 20th century international order and the liberal democratic order within democratic countries in response to it. And my fear is that even if we survive Trumpism and Orbanism initially, that we are still on a trajectory globally to experience some of those conflicts that are going to be exacerbated by artificial intelligence, that are going to be exacerbated by the economic inequality that artificial intelligence and the current economic dynamics are worsening, that are going to be exacerbated by the cultural challenges that we've spoken about. And I think the bigger question, and this will be the cliffhanger for season 2, is, okay, if we manage to survive Trump's attempt to consolidate authoritarian control in the U.S., how do we then tackle those even bigger and broader global dynamics that are pointing us in a very disturbing direction globally for what the next decade looks like around the world? And is there a way that we can pivot to avoid the fate of the early 20th century and move us back on a fourth wave of democracy before it descends into something cataclysmic? And for that, I think listeners will have to tune in to the next season.
Ian Bassin will be back shortly for season 12 of The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk and Ian Bassin. Thank you, Ian. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Yascha. Good to see you.